Sit back, my friend, it's time again. Freshbrewed Science is about to begin.
The case of MinIO is an interesting one. It's one that we've used nonstop for ages to provide S3 compliant storage to things like NASs and SANs and hosts. But in the summer, they abruptly removed the web UI, which left the community going, what the heck, man? Why are you gutting things from the community edition? And just when the turmoil seemed to settle a little bit, they went ahead and recently put the whole project that's the open source version on maintenance mode. So now it won't get any updates. Well, as you can imagine, people aren't willing to fork over $20,000 or $30,000 for an enterprise account. And it's left quite an opening for other open source projects to take off. So a few of the ones that have come to mind are things like Ceph and RustFS and Garage. Today what I'm going to do is show you a few of those, like RustFS and Garage, how to set them up using Docker on a NAS, and then how do I expose and use them on Linux computers as well as in Kubernetes. So let's get going. So let's talk about where we came from, right? Here you can see MinIO as I would log it in, and since I've already removed MinIO, kind of have to see it from some images. But you can see how I would often have the buckets just there on port 9001, and MinIO worked, right? You could use Docker to kind of control it and set up your NAS to use it as you wanted, but with all those changes, I never wanted to update. So now I'm kind of stuck in time with a version of MinIO I don't really want. So what do we do about it, right? So our first trick will be, here we see basically my NAS. So my NAS here, if we do sudo docker ps, we can go ahead and see that there are my files. So Docker is going to be running our RustFS. Now what you see is I've already gone ahead and ran Garage and RustFS. Let's take a look how I did that. The way I did it is I first need to do a sudo docker pull. Now my Docker I need sudo, yours may not. But I go ahead and I pull the latest image. That will pull down the latest RustFS, as we can see is loading in the terminal. Once the container is down, we can do a sudo docker run. Now the way I did this was just like that. I ran sudo docker run with a path all the way to volume 1 RustFS, where I made a folder on my NAS. But let's take a look at that. We can see that there's a data drive right there. And if we do a listing of the data, we're going to see I have a couple of buckets. That's where my buckets are being created on my NAS. And I trust that my Synology NAS with its BTFS is doing a good job with my RAID 1+0, keeping it safe as much as you can in a local NAS, right? There's different levels of storage tiers. So let's take a look at what RustFS looks like from a web UI. Here you can see I made a builder account, and we can see I've created a couple buckets. I have a my test bucket where we have some files going on here, and you can see a bucket with versioning. Now the way we create a bucket is quite simple. We click create bucket, and from here we can do things like give it a name, version, object lock, etc. We can also see these settings right over here with tags. Access keys by default in RustFS have access to anything the admin can do. That's kind of a difference between what you might find with MinIO or find with Garage, which we'll look at in a bit. So here I created a key. If I add an access key, I can give it an expiration. So I can even say, do it for tomorrow. And it's already got a secret key in here, and it'll download it the moment I create it. Demo live. We'll go ahead and create this and see that it's created a key that will download to credentials JSON, as you would expect from any other tool. And since I don't really want this key, I can just as well delete it. And now it's gone. So the key is gone just as easy. We can have users and add them to different groups. Now, some of the user management is in another level of access for Rust. So I'm in the RustFS Community Edition. And then we can see we can import and export users. Here's some IAM configuration. The performance is going to show me the total storage across my whole NAS, not what RustFS is using. So this is showing me all the space available on the drive. So it sees 8.7 TB as it stands right now, and that the used on the whole drive, because I'm not using this much in RustFS, is 1.7 TB. The next thing you can see is we can do things like SSE. Now, one of the things I did in my blog write-up is I set up a case of OpenBow, which is the same thing as an open source version of HashiVault. But I basically set up a Vault instance, an OpenBow instance, and then tied it in for KMS. Now, it got complicated, but you can do it, and I can show how to do it. I'm not doing KMS on my local NAS because I don't feel I need it for local storage. But this is how you would do it. You basically set it up, and once you do it, you can configure the encryption key for the bucket. Now, as I said, not doing it, but this is where you would do it. All right. These are all the basics. We now have a bucket, and of course, you could do all the things you'd expect with a bucket. You could just upload a file here, upload a folder. You can say, look at a file. If it's a text file, you can preview it, which is a pretty nice feature in my mind. But you can also download it. If there's versions, you can see the different versions of it if your bucket has versioning enabled. But then the other thing is I might want to use this now in my local command line client. How would we do that? So you see that I create a key right here. It starts with GNA, okay? I'm going to show you what that looks like now on the command line. So here, let me show you what the access key looks like when I do it in the AWS credentials file. So you can see I have the key name, the key value, and I've given it an endpoint URL of port 9000 running on the NAS, which is on port or on IP 192.168.1.116 in my network. So now if I want to do something like AWS S3 LS and give it the profile, oops, my bad. Give it the profile. I should see the buckets. And I can do things like copy them. So I could do S3. So let's just list the contents of my test bucket. And that should list the contents of my test bucket. What if I want to create a file, right? I could do echo my test to test 123.txt. Sound good? New file name, test 123. Now I do AWS S3 CP of test 123. I go ahead and I do AWS S3 CP. So you see that we did the listing. It's not there. AWS S3 CP of my test 123.txt over to S3 that bucket. Give it the profile. And that should copy the text file over to the bucket. I think I called it just test 123. That should copy it over to the bucket. Now that it's copied over to the bucket, we should be able to do an ls and see that our new file is listed right there in the bucket. And of course, we can do that in the browser just as well. So now that we see that in the browser, if I go to buckets, there's that test 123 file as we fully expected. My test right there. Great. All right. Well, that was RustFS. We saw how easy that was to set up. Now let's take a look at Garage. Is that any easier? Does it even have a web UI? With Garage, you see how I have it already running on the NAS. if I want to show you how I did it, I first do a sudo docker pull of the image. That was the latest, and it shows it's up to date. And then I would do is I would run it with a command of sudo docker run. But what you're going to notice here is that it needs some files. It needs a toml file that's going to have the configuration, and I need to create these directories for the meta and the data folders. To run, it needs to have a data and a meta folder created, and it needs to have a toml file that has the configuration. Let's take a look at that configuration. This will say cat etc garage toml. And what this toml file does is gives it the configuration that it's going to need in order to run Garage. We have our folders. We have our ports. So we have an API, a web, and another version 2 API, which will be we're not using right now, and then an admin port for doing some administration stuff for a RESTful API. Most of what we do in Garage is API and command line driven. It is not done with the web UI. Once I've launched it, I need to configure it. So one of the ways that we do that is we launch a container. We go into the container. So what you see is I do sudo docker ps, and my container name is garage d, right? So what I want to do is go ahead and exec into there. So I can do sudo docker exec -it garage d garage, and see some of the commands. So what I'll do then is garage status, and you can see the status of Garage. So I'm running commands in the container to engage with it. This is actually very similar to how we might use things like a lot of those hashy products like Vault and Console, where you actually run the commands in the container in a safe way to match versions. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is create a layout. And so some of the ways that I've done that is I'm going to alias the Garage command. So if I say which Garage, the alias is gone, so let me re-alias that. And you can see it's right here. And now I can do things like Garage status. And I don't have to do all those docker exec commands. So one of the things you want to do is typically create a new zone, a new node ID. So I will do domain controller. So usually the command looks like that, to assign a zone of DC1 with 1 gig to a controller that matches my node ID. That node ID, as you see, is right here, C852A. That's what lines up to the node ID. And then from there, I can do a layout version, which says go ahead and apply a layout version that will apply the layout version, only it's not really going to give a new amount. So let's do this all new. I think this should be okay. So I'm going to say here, is garage layout assign for zone DC2, let's say 10 gigs, and we're going to give it ASDF. So I've now, there's no nodes that match it, so I guess I got to use the exact node, C852. Now it's created a DC2, but it's not applied. Then we got to do a layout. So this applies it. Garage layout. So we give it a new version. So now the new version has been applied. So I guess I have to apply each version numerically. I didn't know that. That was great. I thought that the version 1 was more related to the API, not that I was applying staged version 1, staged version 2. So let's make a new bucket. I've given it now 10 gigs. This is a test. So now a new bucket has been created. Now this is where it's different than RustFS. I can't just use it with an API token. I need to make a token and assign it the privileges to talk to that bucket. So let's create a new key. Garage key create, we're gonna call this demo live test key. The key's been created. Now this is where I get that key ID and the secret. These are the two things I'm gonna need later on. So I should save them now. I can see that the key was created with garage keys list. And there's my new key. So my next step is to give this key the ability to talk to that bucket we just made. So I'm going to say, give this and allow for read, write, and owner, RWO, of the bucket I made. So what was the name of the bucket? This is a test. And the key is this key. The key name would be the name of the key, not the ID. So now my key can only be used to look at the bucket in question. In fact, let's prove that. All right. So to prove it, let's go ahead and add this to our AWS credentials locally. Now I'm back on my main computer. You can see I've added that same key, the GK1 ends in C3, and that same access key that ends in A60. And what you'll notice with Garage, different than RustFS, is it does want the region to be set to Garage. So that's kind of key. Here's my port, and the reason I can run these both on the same NAS is they're mutually exclusive. RustFS runs on the same ports as MinIO, 9000, 9001. But Garage runs on some ports in the 3900 range. So now if I say AWS S3 CLI profile, I don't expect this to work because this key doesn't have list permissions. But it did see the bucket. I didn't expect that. So I did see just the one bucket. I have two buckets there. But in fact, if we want to see that, I'm not going to show you my key, but there's my other key showing a completely different bucket. This shows that the keys are tied to the buckets. And I can, of course, get the values of these. If I say S3 and say this is a test, we'll see there's no contents in there, right? But much like before, I should do an AWS S3 CP of dash test 123 dot text over to S3 test 123 dot text. It should be able to copy the file to the bucket we've made. Now again, I can go to the NAS and see the content of the bucket, but what we're going to notice here is, remember how I showed you that TOML file? Cat etc garage TOML. There should be a web address here. But what's going to happen is if I try to go there and I go to 192.168.116, of course that's my RustFS, and we try to go to 3902, we'll see if we just get a 404 not found. So they're working on it. It's not there yet. So I expect to see a better web browser. There's a group that made a web browser, but I didn't find it actually worked. It's a very active project. My experience so far, no working web. But I now have two different ways to access storage on my NAS. So what are our takeaways? Well, figured out that RustFS works pretty darn good, but has rather permissive default permissions on the API keys. We found that Garage, it has very clear permissions boundaries on its API keys, but both tools have a bit of a lacking. So Garage didn't really have a working web UI, and we found that the storage tiers in RustFS, they didn't really seem to do anything. Now both these projects are very active and very new. I expect to see both keep going, and I will probably watch both and try both since they operate on different ports on the same NAS and start to investigate memory usage over time. So I hope you found this tutorial interesting, and I hope where you are it's nice and warm. All right, have a good one.
Coffee and keyboards, that's my kind of art. Containers and coffee,